Hey, what is going on, guys? Jake Verdon Tech here, back with another video. And today just wanted to give you guys a build video of an ITX PC I recently built for some family friends. Essentially, they're looking to replace their all-in-one desktop PC with something that is compact but has enough power for some editing in Photoshop, Lightroom, and then working on their website for their business. So we're going to kind of go through the parts, kind of discuss the reasoning behind why I chose some of these parts for them, then go over the build experience. So starting off with the case, I knew immediately ITX was going to be probably the right application for them, as we did start them off with all-in-one Lenovo desktops, which was mainly to conserve space, not having a big box on the countertop or underneath the desk. And looking into the ITX case market, it's changed quite a bit since I've last done a build. There is a lot of offerings now, especially coming from our mainstream manufacturers and coming at a much more competitive price. And while we're on the subject of price, we tried to keep the budget around $1,500. So that had me land on the A4 H20 from Lian. I've been a big fan of some of the cases they put out. My current build's in the 011 Dynamic Mini, and I've had nothing but good things to say about it. And minus the sandwich layout, this case reminds me a lot of the Ncase M1. And if visible, it has a very clean aesthetic to it, so I thought it'd be the perfect fit. Moving on to some of our core components, we decided to go with a Ryzen 7 7700X. The CPU has 8 cores, 16 threads, plenty of power and speed for what they're doing. This one, people may question, but we ended up going with the RTX 3060, the Ventus 3X from MSI. I think the argument here is, why didn't you go with a 4060? Well, price is definitely one of those factors, and I don't think you're getting much more performance out of the 4060 when it comes to overall productivity performance. In-game, you would maybe notice the higher clock speeds of a 4060, but we are getting a few more gigs of VRAM out of the 3060, which I think is going to be much better for what their application is and fit into the budget a little bit better. For the motherboard, we want the Strix B650E, 32 gigs of Vengeance RGB DDR5, and a 1TB 980 Pro SSD from Samsung. We did a Corsair H100x AIO for the cooling, and lastly we did a Corsair SF750 to power this system. As far as the build goes, overall it went pretty smooth. ITX form factor builds can always pose a challenge just because the limited availability of space, and the Lian A4 ITX case was no exception to this. But there are factors that make it a bit easier than other cases in its class to work in, such as having all the panels come off and really full flexibility to work all around the PC. I definitely recommend not tightening down everything fully until you have exactly where you want the components to be in some of the cable management. That way you'll be able to make adjustments along the way if you need to reroute cables or tubing to your AIO or any other components. The AIO is probably the trickiest component to fit just due to the longer tubing runs for a mid-tower case. And my goal was to definitely have the inlets on the CPU block to be on the left side of the block itself. That way we don't have any points in the AIO that are lower than the CPU pump. We were pretty close to the boundaries on the GPU length, but the A4 can support up to 322mm in length for your GPU. And it does allow for 2-slot GPUs, so if you're within those parameters, your graphics card should fit no problem. Kind of reflecting on the case and our GPU placement, this is a sandwich layout case, as I mentioned earlier. And if you're not familiar with that, that is essentially where you have the motherboard and CPU and its components on one side of the case, and then with the use of a riser cable that wraps around the back of the motherboard plate, allows you to mount the GPU on the other side of where the motherboard is. In the sub 12 liter case category, this can be essential just because there is not much room to work with, and it tends to get very wide when you have all the components on one side without vertically mounting your GPU in some orientation. With the functionality, it does give it a very cool aesthetic. I've always been a big fan of the look of these sandwich style cases, even though it will most likely be covered most of the time. The only other notable thing about the build that I definitely wanted to put out there as I was building this one, and that is to do with our Strix motherboard and potentially many other motherboards on the market right now, and how the M.2 is mounted. So this particular motherboard and potentially many others on the market right now are getting away from using a set screw to actually hold the M.2 down in place. and they are resorting to a plastic retention lever to hold it down, which I'm not against at all. I think it's actually a pretty good implementation because these set screws, they are tiny. They're easy to drop when you're trying to install it, especially if you don't have the components out of the case. The problem I ran into with this particular motherboard is when everything was set properly and I went to put the M.2 cover back on with the included thermal pads, I actually noticed a pretty significant gap below the M.2, and when you would tighten the cover on, it wanted to flex the drive itself. So as soon as I saw that, and I didn't even have it halfway tightened, I immediately backed off the screws, took a closer look at the actual mounting for the M.2 drive. In this case, Asus includes this little knob that can actually be applied underneath the M.2. So I tried going that route, but I still had a pretty significant gap, and then as you would tighten the cover on, the M.2 would flex again. What I ended up doing was taking the extra thermal pad they include and putting it below the M.2 to give it that extra cushion and to prevent that huge space below it. That way, when you go to tighten the cover on, it's fully supported and you don't have any sort of flex in the M.2 SSD. I've seen some other people in forums having this issue, so definitely be mindful of it when you are tightening on your cover on any newer motherboard right now that uses this type of securing system for your M.2 drives. But if you use something like the included knob, if it works in your case, or if you use an extra thermal pad like I did and you notice that your drive is fully supported, you should be good. Definitely wanted to call that out. It's been a bit since I built a PC and I haven't seen this issue on other motherboards I've worked with, and in my opinion it's kind of over-engineered. Moving on to performance, we didn't do a ton of testing. I did run Heaven Benchmark a little bit just to make sure everything was good on the GPU. Our average FPS was right around 200, but this was only on a 24-inch 1080p monitor. And under load, the temperatures were pretty safe, right around 68 to 70 C. And same goes for the CPU. We didn't see anything north of 68 C when performing any types of rendering, which in our case, not as much of a concern because we don't have the most demanding hardware in this system. But if you are running a beefier graphics card or CPU, the cooling can definitely be a concern as you don't have a whole lot of space to incorporate fans and more cooling components. In our configuration, and kind of the one a lot of other people run in this case, is we have two exhaust fans located at the top of the case, which are attached to the radiator, which naturally allows any hot air in the system to be exhausted out the top. So I think that covers most of this build. Overall, I gotta say it's a fantastic little PC. Definitely does a great job at any type of light editing work, whether it's Photoshop, Lightroom, a little bit of Premiere, or other editing softwares for video. This PC will handle it just fine. This would make a great gaming rig as well, but you will be kind of limited on your display. I think 1080p, 1440p at the most is going to be your sweet spot. And then of course it also is a factor how large of a display you're trying to run and for whichever type of game you're trying to run. Thank you guys so much for checking out the video. Hopefully you found it helpful. Hopefully you found it informative if you're looking into building an ITX PC similar to this. If you guys want to see more tech related videos like this one, be sure to subscribe. As always guys, thank you for watching and I'll see you in the next video.